And thanks for all of you for joining. I think these are extraordinary times and we need extraordinary effort. So since things are already worse, things can only get better from here. And for that, I congratulate JNUSU for leading this highly spirited struggle, and we should continue these efforts, right? So the topic I really chose today is in terms of, while we endorse protests and protests of this kind with high spirit, I also strongly feel that there is a need now to rethink the nature of protests in populist times, right? That we cannot continue to imagine protests the way we did for last half a century or so. So why do I say this? Because I think populism, has this ability, especially populist majoritarianism has this ability not only to fix the dominant narrative, but it has an uncanny ability to fix and weaponize even the counter narratives. That the counter narratives that we feel we are countering something, populism already fixes a place for that opposition. That is why it is so hard to break the populist stronghold, because they already fix a place for you, right? So I want you to, I've come with a few questions, and I am inviting you to think along with me, that what is it that we have to think afresh in the nature of our protest politics, right? So that we can overcome this populist majoritarian challenge. So one of the things that I'm suggesting is that populism, especially majoritarian populism, draws this uncanny ability to weaponize even counter narratives, to weaponize counter-hegemony, what Gramsci would have called. That's the strong point of populist majoritarianism. Therefore, protests such as these should be ideal sites to open up these spaces, for us to think afresh, what is that we are protesting against and where are we ending up? Because today, under this populist majoritarianism, we have moved substantially from manufacturing consent to manufacturing dissent. Today, the model of governance is not manufacturing consent, the way Chomsky wrote 50 years back. Today, the populist mode of governance is manufacturing dissent. So it already occupies that space of dissent that you and I feel belong to us, rightfully, that we are the ones questioning dissent, but populism already is manufacturing dissent. Therefore, I want to share I'm thinking aloud here, still formulating this, that I think there is something very unique in this populist regimes in terms of its narrative capacity. So if you take some of the 3 or 4 dominant movements of our time, I want to put before you my analysis as to how these movements have proceeded and what is it that the regime is doing with them. Take the recent ongoing movements of UGC regulations. What does a populist majoritarian, populist polarization, what does it do with this? It gave a UGC regulation saying that all discrimination against SC, ST, OBCs should be punishable, with no definitive definition of discrimination, with no definitive definition of process and procedures. And this is not happenstance. This is not lazy thinking, but this is deep thinking. So it deliberately puts a proposal that incites a section of society against other because of legitimate concerns of discrimination. Discrimination is legitimate. Protest against discrimination is legitimate. So please understand that populist majoritarianism articulates an underlying structural condition to its advantage. So with the UGC regulation, what comes across clearly is that it puts this regulation, it knows that there will be resistance, it allows dominant castes to protest for 3 or 4 days, they go on a rampage, they claim aggressive victimhood. I call it aggressive victimhood. Victimhood is usually submissive, but this is aggressive victimhood. We have never seen such victims in the world who are aggressive. हाँ हम विक्टिम है, ऐसे कौन बोलता है? विक्टिम डर डर के रहता है हमारा विक्टिम इंडिया में वो मतलब ये छाती खोल के बोलता मैं विक्टिम हूँ, वो जो असली विक्टिम है वो डरा हुआ कहीं है। तो ये अग्रेसिव विक्टिमहुड का डिस्प्ले होता है हमारा स्ट्रीट्स पे, वो यहाँ तक होता है। ये पॉपुलिज्म का देखिए यूनिक भी है, सिनिकल पार्ट भी है कि प्रोटेस्टर्स गो ऑन हिटिंग विथ चप्पल्स द फोटोग्राफ्स ऑफ प्राइम मिनिस्टर मोदी, but nothing happens to them. What is the messaging that happens? You will have to give your eye to a certain kind of details under populist mobilization. There is no space for generality. अब ब्रॉड जनरलिटी में जाएंगे, उधर कास्ट हिंदू प्रोटेस्ट है, ये हमारा दलित बहुजन है, वो काम चलने वाला नहीं है। अब the details of it is this, that they allow, so today's populists are such that they will weaponize even themselves. उनको अपने आप पे वार करा के बोलेंगे देखिए ये वार हो रहा है, चप्पल पिटवा के कहेंगे देखिए हमारे साथ क्या हो रहा है, because they understand that manufacturing dissent is the new mode of governing the population. You let it out. So होता क्या है, you have this dominant groups, there is the display of this aggressive victimhood, then you rest of the groups, then what happens, they know it will go to the court, कोर्ट में वो स्टे हो जाएगा, अब दूसरा ग्रुप उतरेगा सड़क पे। होता क्या है, ऑप्टिक्स में क्या हुआ है फाइनली, those who protested against have genuinely protested because it's a long drawn concern of Dalit, Bahujan, marginalized sections that there should be more checks and balance on campus lives against caste discrimination. But the optics of it, how does it work? It looks that as if the regime is sincere in its efforts in arresting discrimination on campuses, therefore it brought these UGC regulations. And they are helpless because courts are putting a stay. And then the Dalit Bahujans are on the ground, so for an ordinary Dalit Bahujan students, not you JNU lot, for an ordinary Dalit Bahujan student it looks as if this government is with us. It has led to certain aggrieving. देखिए डोमिनेंट कास्ट पहली बार सड़क पर उतरना पड़ा तो उसमें थोड़ा देर खुशी मना लेंगे हम लोग कि डोमिनेंट कास्ट भी look vulnerable, they also look like victims. In the end, what this populist polarization does, and this is the fascinating part of it, is that as it polarizes the society, it draws the support from both sections of the society. Dominant sections, they know, cannot go anywhere else. And dominant sections, by allowing them that kind of aggressive protest, already have drawn their consent towards the regime. Dalit Bahujans, on the other hand, feel their consent should be given because here is a regime which has at least attempted to do something about discrimination. Nobody has else done anything in the past. This is the optics which we need to be conscious. Therefore, the question I would ask those of you who were protesting on the streets, how did you expect a regime, once you call this regime in terms of Brahmanical order, you expect the same regime to give you such legislation, such a weapon in your hand to arrest the power of the dominant groups? How does this happen? There is something ahistorical in the way we are thinking. We are being pushed into that corner to think in that way. Because this, what they are doing is articulating legitimately certain underlying structural condition in such a way that where you are jammed. And this is where I am saying that under populist conditions, we need to rethink our protests. The question that I ask you, those of you who have been active with this protest, is what should have been different in our protests? Legislation आ गया, आप लोग खुश हो. Withdraw हो गया, streets पे उतर गए. That's why I call this predictable protest. Ruling classes today are thinking dialectically. Protest politics have become prosaic, formulaic, predictable. No protest will succeed in generating a counter-hegemony if they are so predictable, if they have such predictable forms of protest, such predictable forms of narrative, because they have already been sorted out by the ruling elite. They already know what you are going to say. You will say social justice. They will keep inciting you. Therefore, our Honorable VC gave a statement, victimhood hai, psyche hai, blacks और दलित्स का. Again they are inciting you. Again फिर तुम लोग कूद जाओगे कल से. हाँ देखो बोल रहा किशन मैं रेडी हूँ सर कूदने के लिए. चाहते ही है ये लोग कि आप लोग कूद जाओ कल से. फिर बोलेंगे नहीं 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 विड्रॉ करेंगे, फिर आप सोचोगे. So there is something happening. You have to pause and think. Sites of protest of this kind should not be merely left to sloganeering and repeating what are our. We'll have to open up these spaces for hard thinking. That what is happening, how is power reconfiguring itself in populist times? It is not a conventional mode of governance. This mode of governance is something new that comes with various other things. I will not have the time to get into the details. So that's my first case to you, that if you look at this case closely, you will understand that all the legislations that have come, all the public issues that this regime has projected in last 10 years, I call it nobody gains anything, nobody loses anything, but the regime wins. This is their strategy. ना किसी का कुछ मिलेगा, ना किसी का कुछ जाएगा, लेकिन हम जीतेंगे. ये बड़ा दिलचस्प स्ट्रैटेजी है. आप EWS स्कीम को ले लो, थ्रेडबेर उसका एनालिसिस करो, 8 लाख कैप है. 8 lakh cap even in general category would mean 80 to 85% of the people come in that cap. वो बचा हुआ 15% वैसे भी JNU जैसे इंस्टीट्यूशन में आएंगे नहीं, वो जाएंगे अशोका, नहीं तो वो चले जाएंगे लंदन. मतलब हो क्या रहा है, वही 80% लोग आ रहे हैं, बट इस बार एक सर्टिफिकेट लेके आ रहे हैं, हाँ हम EWS है. और उसका खासियत क्या है, दे डिलिबरेटली एलिमिनेट SC, ST एंड OBC. इस बार SC, ST, OBC इधर इंक्लूड किया रेगुलेशन में, उधर SC, ST, OBC को एक्सक्लूड कर दिया. तो यू आर नॉट इन EWS, लेकिन EWS किसको मिल रहा, people who already would have got, even otherwise these are the same groups which have got the admission. So nobody gains anything, nobody loses anything, but there is a social conflict in the society. Take triple talaq. वो इतना हवा चला, ट्रिपल तलाक हम बैन कर रहे हैं, हम बैन. Look, go read the legislation. They have criminalized the Muslim men. चलो ठीक है, मान लेते हैं कि suppose we are opposed to triple talaq, इसके लिए कुछ penal ये होना चाहिए. But they have not given alimony to Muslim women. मुस्लिम को वुमेन को कुछ मिलेगा नहीं, मुस्लिम मेन गेट्स क्रिमिनलाइज्ड. अब हम लोग किस तरफ हो, आप लोग ना इधर हो सकते हो ना उधर. So entire regime is generating this kind of a mobilization where they are hanging you in the air. Therefore I am suggesting that we will have to rethink some fresh narrative. If you look at even the electoral strategy closely, take the Muslim question. What is that they are doing with the Muslim question, or even with the caste question? If you take the Muslim question, they will build a polarized atmosphere, push back Muslims so hard that secular parties start feeling that if we side with the Muslims, there will be Hindu backlash. मैं तो इन पार्टियों के लीडर से मिलता रहता हूँ, उनका वही मैं कहता हूँ, भाई कुछ स्ट्रॉन्ग पोजीशन ले लो आप लोग, कुछ मामले में तो लेना पड़ेगा, कम से कम मॉब लिंचिंग के इस पे तो ले लो. बोलो सर लेना तो चाहते, लेकिन हिंदू बैकलैश होगा, जो इतना वोट मिलना है वो भी नहीं मिलेगा हमको. So secular parties are pushed on the back foot, they don't take a strong position. So what happens, then you have space for somebody like OIC. OIC will come with a strong polarized counter narrative. His brother will come and abuse Hindu gods and goddesses. तो एक नया पोलराइज एटमॉस्फेयर बन गया आपको. एंड लुक एट द कंडीशन, इफ मुस्लिम्स डोंट सपोर्ट OIC, यू आर ऑन द बैक फुट. इफ दे सपोर्ट OIC, वोट्स गेट डिवाइडेड एंड देयरफॉर secular parties are defeated and BJP comes back to power. So we are again made to question this. How should Muslims resist majoritarian order? Is it by claiming Muslim identity? Is it by not disowning that Muslim identity? We don't have a solution. If you claim too much of Muslim identity, you further end up with the same polarization. If you go for some kind of a larger identity, then there's a possibility of getting invisibilized. This is at the heart. So it is not about just generating a protest that matters. It is what is the character of our counter-hegemony. Simply having a critique against regime is not a counter-hegemony. When do you make a counter-hegemony? You begin to make a counter-hegemony when your narrative is able to explain a whole lot of fragmented social demands. That is when a counter-hegemony is produced in society. That is when we should have a counter-narrative. That's why in my recent piece on Umar Khalid, I said that Umar Khalid was not arrested because he was a Muslim. This is the dominant narrative of our secular friends, but I beg to disagree. Umar Khalid is arrested because he has transgressed his Muslim identity. He is somebody who can speak for tribals of central India. Anand Teltunde is arrested not because he is a Dalit, because he is a Dalit who can talk about corporate Hindutva, who can talk about neoliberal India. Stan Swami is arrested not because he is a Christian, but he is a Christian who can talk about right to education. Varavar Rao is arrested because he is a Brahmin by birth, but not by his karma. This is the model that challenges this government. The mode of challenge is that what this regime really gets worked up and what should the counter-hegemony look like is this: that identities that we claim should transgress the boundaries of those identities to form new forms of solidarity. The problem I have with UGC kind of protest is that we should be the one talking about alternate forms of solidarity. Not simply keep protesting and walk into that polarization trap. वो अप्पू का जैसे वो दिखता है ना सिनेमा में, अप्पू जो छोटा एलिफेंट रहता है उसको एक ट्रैप लगाते हो, जाके सीधा उसी में गिर जाता है. हमें अप्पू नहीं बनना है, हमें इसको समझना है कि ये ट्रैप ले क्या कर रहे हैं पॉपुलिस्ट रेजिम्स. We should fight discrimination. An ideal mode of protest of UGC kind should have been, we should fight discrimination and also talk about fraternity. Also talk about alternate forms of caste solidarities. An ideal Dalit Bahujan movement should have strong empathy for those poor who come from Brahmins. If they are poor, you should have that equal empathy. An ideal form of solidarity would be that a Brahmin woman escapes patriarchy through intercaste marriages. This should be our counter narrative. That we should have counter narratives are formed when you become the universal and reduce the other side into particularity. Today what populist regime do is that they have occupied that space of universality and we are only a part of that universality. We are talking on their terms. If you want to transgress that universality, is by alternate universality. How do you form that alternative universality? Is that you fight discrimination, think dialectically, that you bring discrimination, fight of discrimination, justice, equality with fraternity. We have to forge and reimagine new forms of solidarity. Which is what will threaten this regime? Because one thing this regime is terribly petrified by is new forms of solidarity. Imagine a Dalit Bahujan standing at Delhi University and expressing his empathy for a poor Brahmin who is struggling to complete his education. This will petrify this regime. That is what Umar Khalid did. The way why they are so angry with Umar Khalid is he said, वो डंडा मारेंगे, हम प्यार से बात करेंगे. हम बात कर रहे एजुकेशन के लिए, हम बात कर रहे न्यूलिबरलिज्म के खिलाफ, हम बात कर रहे ट्राइबल्स के बारे में. This is the right struggle for citizenship, not CA. CA is fine, okay, one form of fight for citizenship. But the real form of fight for citizenship is to defeat the secular sectarianism that this regime is pushing all of us into. The long-term strategy of the regime is to make all of us vulnerable into smaller fragments, and therefore Hindutva will become the only universal. It will become the only universal language through which we can communicate. We should not fall prey, and that is where I feel farmers' movement to some extent was an exception. That farmers' movement in the last 10 years was the only movement which could quickly recalibrate. But I'll tell you the dark and underside of the farmers' movement too. That when they began only with the demand for MSP. But as the farmers' movements proceeded, if you look at the second and third stage of the farmers' movement, they began to talk about neoliberal model of development. They began to talk about JNU protests. Farmers were the first one to say that JNU intellectuals need freedom of expression, because if there are no intellectuals with freedom, who will speak for us? This is the new equivalence. That farmers could connect their agrarian demands, MSP, to corporate model of development, freedom of expression. This is how you form a new universal, the alternate universal. Even then, the farmers' movement made that one step forward. But even then, when you got the Haryana elections, farmers movement had very little impact, because when we were all celebrating farmers movement here, and when BJP came back to power, I visited Haryana to understand. And you found that this regime is thinking in such deeply dialectical terms. For the first time, I thought critical theory teaches us that dialectics is about defeating and displacing and decentering power. For the first time, I thought dialectics can also be for dominant hegemony. When I went to Haryana, I found that they have used this narrative of Jat protests to counter-polarize the entire society against Jats. What looked like a progressive protest to us sitting in Delhi looked like a protest of the rich peasantry and the dominant Jat community to the rest of the society in Haryana. That's why they could polarize, and immediately they voted. When I went and asked, "Theek hai, Jat rich protest hai aap," they said one thing. When I asked, the first house I landed up in Haryana was of a Dalit household. He said, "Sir, 2 साल तक आप बताइए कौन बॉर्डर पे बैठ सकते हैं, जिसके पास समय हो, जिसके पास पैसे हो। ये पैसे वाले हैं, जनरेटर चला रहे, फ्रिज चला रहे, एसी चला रहे, और आप लोग दिल्ली में जाके उधर नारा देते हो।" चलो मैं बोला, चलो मान लो रिच फार्मर से। The issue that followed later was those wrestlers, women wrestlers के साथ जो गलत हुआ है, and they were dragged on the streets. At least that you should stand by. They said, "Sir, ये तो हमारे औरतों के साथ डेली होता है इधर। जब डोमिनेंट कास्ट के औरत के साथ होते हैं, आप लोग दिल्ली से उतर के इधर गांव में आते हो। Look at the caste dynamic suddenly how it plays up." So this is the dialectics that we have to think. This is how complex social formations work. This regime under populism, that's why the populist regimes last so long, and they empty the society of this social, because they understand the micro dynamics of social contradictions. We thought, yes, one side of the farmers movement was progressive, and I bet that those photographs, those scenes that we saw on televisions of those Jat wrestlers being dragged was a very calibrated move by the state. That they wanted you to see those pictures, because the marginalized caste for the first time felt empowered. कि भाई इनके साथ भी ऐसा हो रहा है, ये तो हम लोगों के साथ होता है। यही चीज़ जो है आज यूजीसी के साथ हो रहा है। ओबीसी दलित विल फील हैप्पी, बस देखो अपर कास्ट लोग भी रो रहे हैं, इनको भी सड़क पे उतरना पड़ रहा है, ये भी डर रहे हैं। This is a psychological empowerment. This is a psychological warfare that this regime is doing on us, which is a legitimate, based on a structural condition. Yes, there is caste discrimination, so it's natural for certain marginalized groups to feel a sense of empowerment to see dominant groups on the road. But that is the optics of it. Now, how are you going to break free from this? How else are you going to find a structural articulation? What is the other kind of structural articulation that you are going to find, which is going to bring us out from this stronghold? This is where you have to learn critical theory. Now, I will end by citing Nancy Fraser's one article that I am really fond of, is her piece on feminism and capitalism, where she makes this point. We will be discussing it soon in the class, where she makes this point that how did the convergence between second wave feminism and neoliberalism happen in 1990s? Second wave feminism was making legitimate demands against the state. Second wave feminism came with the right point that state suffers from male epistemic bias. Therefore, state laws suffer from male epistemic bias. So what was the demand of the second wave feminism? They said that withdrawal of the state. We don't want the state, we will fight. That was precisely the time of neoliberalism, of the Thatcherite time, when Thatcher was calling nanny state, and when neoliberalism wanted a rollback of the state. Now tell me, how do you explain this convergence, which is what Nancy Fraser calls the uncanny double? How do you explain this convergence between a progressive second wave feminist demands and a neoconservative authoritarian neoliberal processes? History is full of such conjunctures. And that's why Fraser says The way second wave feminist demands got re-signified is what produces the uncanny double. That the second wave feminism made legitimate demands, but their effect, their consequence, their outcome, their meaning got completely re-signified by neoliberal capital. They used the legitimate demands of feminism to legitimize withdrawal of state, to withdraw welfareism, to withdraw legal protections, to roll back state in trade union movement, to bring in labor codes. So it's a convergence. Feminism demands withdrawal of state, neoliberalism wants rollback of the state. History is never therefore linear and simple. History always produces dialectically such conjunctures. How do you come out? And Fraser goes on to suggest that the only way we can come out of these conundrums is by formulating alternate resignification of those processes. Right? This is what I'm suggesting we do in course of our protest. That when we have regulations, we should not be victims of this populist authoritarian regimes. We should not allow and walk into the booby traps they are laying for us. You will have to think in more robust universal terms, and you have to think in more dialectical ways. The moment UGC regulation was made by this regime, many people wrote this came because of long protest by Dalit Bahujans. Sorry, I disagree. This is a regime which did not take Rohit Vemula's death seriously, and you expect this regime to be sensitive enough to give you a UGC handout? Why did you not feel this? Why did you not think this? The moment regulation came, you were all up in arms. हमें चाहिए चाहिए, टॉफी मिल गया. वो टॉफी ला रहा है, वापस ले रहा है, टॉफी ला रहा है, वापस ले रहा है. और हम लोग we are becoming victims of their play. It was precisely to create a social conflict. If you look at the 10-year-long period, the agenda and the strategy of the regime is emphasize a narrative of cultural unity and create permanent social conflicts. You have to get the big picture of what the regime is up to. Therefore, they will talk of unity from Kashi to Kanchi. तो कल्चरल यूनिटी का बात करेंगे, हम सब एक है. आप भी नारा देते हो हम सब एक है, वो भी कह रहा हम सब एक है, ऊपर नॉर्थ से लेके साउथ तक हम एक है. But cultural unity will come with deepening social conflicts. They will divide each subcaste in India. Look at what is happening with the subcaste question. Look at with the classification question. Again, I'm telling you, the challenging part is that they're articulating a genuine articulation of an underlying structural condition. What is happening with the OBC question? They are mobilizing all smaller OBCs against the dominant OBCs. What happens with that? The two things happen with that. One, the dominant OBCs who are in a better mobilized with better resources, who are in a position to challenge the dominant hegemony, they become weak. And the weaker OBCs are in no position to resist the dominant hegemony. ये जो आप representation का खेल देख रहे हो इस regime में और बड़ा खुश हो रहे हो कि देखो यहाँ यादव अपॉइंट कर दिया, इधर एक इसको दलित को अपॉइंट कर दिया, उधर इसको अपॉइंट कर दिया, और कांग्रेस वो खेल नहीं पा रहा है. क्यों? What is the underlying structural logic? Bring weaker caste to represent, they will not be able to resist and they will fall in line. Representation तो है उसमें, लेकिन these groups will not be able to resist or raise legitimate questions which are different from this regime. Now, is this democratic or undemocratic? To the extent that they're giving space to the weakest of the Dalit groups, the weakest of the OBC subcaste, from one point of view looks completely nothing short of being revolutionary in Indian society. But when its outcome comes, in terms of its structural outcome, it is actually neoconservative. William Reck, in his book Mass Psychology of Fascism, makes this brilliant point that authoritarian rulers mobilize rebellious emotions and reactionary values. And I think that that insight of William Reich fits well with what is happening with the populist mobilization in India. That the emotions that they are mobilizing in Haryana against Jat, the emotions they are mobilizing of the smaller Dalits against dominant Dalit subcaste, of the smaller OBC subcaste against dominant subcaste are rebellious emotions. But its outcomes and the values that they are mobilizing in course of that are reactionary values. This is no small historical challenge, right? Because there can be no upfront attack. You cannot go and tell this regime that no, don't appoint weaker subcaste. That will be anti-democratic. That in fact will be an authoritarian language. Look at the double whammy in this. So they are actually democratizing. That's why there is so much of resonance with what they are doing on the ground. But even as they expand the representation case, your social agenda, your redistributive agenda, your egalitarian struggles will go on getting weakened. How are you going to counter this? What is your counter narrative? Therefore, in my own writings, I have argued that the opposition has not even started to think of what the counter-hegemonic narrative should look like. They are only opposing, day by day. It's an ad hoc opposition. A deeper opposition will need young minds like you in JNU. If this cannot happen in JNU, it cannot happen anywhere. So JNU is the place where we'll have to put our minds together, give up these old modes of, conventional modes of thinking about social justice, conventional modes of thinking about equality, conventional modes of thinking about left revolutions. The question at the heart of it is that a regime which is legitimately articulating certain legitimately transformative demands and weaponizing them for a neoconservative monolithic order, which is, I think, simply mind-boggling. The way it is able to do, of course, because of its organizational heft, the data analytics, they have big data, there are a lot of resources, there are other advantages, they have complete media control to control the narratives, all those advantages exist. But those all will fizzle out if we can find an alternative narrative that looks more universal, that looks more transformative, that can bring in more genuine, authentic transformation. What should that narrative be? As far as I could think, I think it is a certain combination of question of discrimination rights with fraternity. That will need a new political subjectivity where you are not only critical of the regime, but we have to be self-introspective of our own positions, of our own prejudices, each political subjectivity that we occupy, each social position that we occupy. Can we mobilize a self-introspecting new political subjectivity where we are not only fighting the hegemony of those above us, but are conscious of those who are below us, because we are a graded society of graded inequalities. This, I think, this ethic of dialectically thinking of this, I think, is the most transformative ethic of our time. And I hope this is just the starting point, and protests of this kind will give us new spaces to rethink some of these issues. I'll stop here. Thanks for your patience.